Chapter 12, Sticky Notes. We're going to start our sticky notes on page 309. So on page 309, you need to know the structure of a forest. Now I know we don't have a forest here in Santa Clarita, and so some of these terms might be unfamiliar to you. So take some time to really know what is the different parts of a forest are with their terms, because again, you're not used to this. So the tops of the forest is the canopy. There's some species that only live in the canopies, by the way. Another one is the understory. So these are things, plants and things that grow low, kind of under the taller trees. And the understory is something that can get overgrown when we suppress fires. We have the forest floor, we have the soil, we have leaf litter, so all the leaves that fall off the tree make leaf litter down here. Moss and epiphytes, so we have mosses that grow and travel up trees and live on the trees as support to get some light for photosynthesis. A fallen log is a great habitat as it decomposes and decays. It's extremely important habitat for species. A snag is a tree that has died, but it's still standing, and that's actually important habitat too for other species as well. So a forest is extremely diverse. A natural forest is extremely diverse. So an old growth forest is one that's never been logged. It contains more biodiversity. It's crucial habitat for some endangered species. For example, the spotted owl only lives in old growth forest. You need to know a lot of ways that forests provide ecosystem services. So when you are studying for this test, make sure you can memorize a few of these things that forests do for us. A big one is that forests sequester carbon. So through photosynthesis, when plants take in CO2, the carbon gets stored in usually their trunks. About 80% of it is in their trunks, and it keeps it there. And so it is called carbon sequestration. Extremely important. And then we have economic benefits of forests down here too. We make a lot of money off of forests, standing or cutting them down too. All right, so when we cut down forests, there's some things that happen. So we have soil degradation through erosion, because now there's not as many roots to hold the soil in place, so it erodes. Many species go extinct because they live in the upper canopies or in the forest floors or whatever. There's just not their habitat. Biodiversity loss because of species extinction. When we cut down forests, this prevents CO2 from being sequestered, and so that CO2 is in the atmosphere, which causes global warming. If we burn the trees, then we actually release that sequestered carbon. Forest loss can collapse a civilization, like on Easter Island. They cut down their forests to build boats and to haul those giant statues, and then they didn't have those forests to help prevent erosion and for animal habitat to eat, all that kind of thing. Deforestation, so forest loss causes an increase in the temperature in streams because there's not shade. So when you have less shade, you're going to increase the temperature, and in the streams and the soil. So the soil is hotter, the streams are hotter, which changes the species that can live there. So cool water species like trout will go away because the water's too hot. It decreases groundwater because trees, when it rains, all of those roots capture that water. It sequesters that water and sends it underground to aquifers. Without those trees, more runs off and is not sequestered underground. Increase in evaporation of water from the soil. So again, less shade, hotter temperatures evaporates water from the soil. And then we have more soil nutrient loss. A lot of times from increased erosion, but also when you have less trees, you have less leaf litter decaying, decomposing, adding nutrition to the soil. But deforestation is an advantage economically. So even though we have all of these really bad things that happen, people still do it because they make money. And we also use paper. So we're going to talk about some sustainable ways to use our forest resources. By the way, this is a big list, but every single one of these things has been on an AP test question before. So you really need to memorize all of the things that happen with forest loss. Going on to page 313, we have up here slash and burn. Now, slash and burn is sometimes called swidden agriculture. It's mostly in tropical areas. This is a picture in Brazil. So you cut down the forest, you burn it to get rid of it because it's too expensive to haul it out of the forest to sell. So what happens is if you cut down and burn a forest so that you have the area for your cattle or for your crops, then all of that sequestered carbon goes back to the atmosphere. So on the AP test, they call it reoxygenating. So that carbon stored in the tree, when you burn it, when it goes up into the air, it combines with O2 to become CO2. So the carbon is reoxygenating, the C plus O2. You also need to know on this page that the highest amount of biodiversity is in our tropical region. So here's the equator right here, where my pencil is. And you can see the numbers are the highest for biodiversity. But it also means that there's so much loss going on too because of huge amounts of deforestation. Turn the page to 315. Know this figure here about maximal sustainable years. So in the United States, we cut down forests, but we also have to replant them so they grow back. And so forest managers try to figure out what's the most sustainable way to grow or level to cut so it can grow back sustainably and not damage the ecosystems too much. They do the same with fishing and quotas. We learned about this with Tragedy of the Commons. The Fish and Wildlife managers determine the maximum sustainable yield for fishing, for hunting, for deforestation, for all our natural resources in the U.S. But a lot of countries don't have that sustainability. On page 316, know what the National Forest Services does. It manages the use of land, so you can log national forest, not national parks, national forest land, but you have to have a permit. You can also do recreation and camping, and there's certain places set aside for recreation and not logging. Gifford Pinchot was the developer of the National Forest Service. There are types of public lands here. You don't have to memorize these, but just be aware that we have all of these protected areas, most of them over here in the western United States by us is a lot of public land, and that's because the United States was settled from the East Coast to the West Coast, and by the time we were settling till about 1900, and then we realized, oh no, we can't settle all this land because we need to save some, and then they were able to save it because this was mostly open land, and it now is public land. On page 317, when we cut down a forest, the laws are now to replant it, but a lot of times when they replant the forest, they do it in the trees that are the most economical to harvest. So they plant pretty much all the same kind of tree, or maybe 2 or 3 different trees. So we end up with monoculture of trees and even age trees, which means that we have less niches and less biodiversity, and sometimes they're called tree farms. So there's different species that eat food from different trees or live in different kinds of trees, and so if you replant with all the same kind of tree, you're going to have less different species that live there. All right, page 317. On page 317, it talks about clear cutting. Clear cutting is the cheapest and safest way, which is basically cutting down the entire forest at once. It's not the entire forest. It's a patch of forest, but it's totally clear. And so with clear cutting, we have more soil erosion, more sun, which changes the species. We talked about that earlier. The warmer species will move in, but it's the cheapest and safest for humans. What you can do instead as a sustainable alternate is to cut small groups of medium and large trees in uneven aged forest. And so we have some examples of this down here. So our alternate to clear cutting, if this is our original forest, clear cutting is just boom, gone. This one is not that common, just leaving a few trees to provide seeds to replant the forest. But in some places, like in Idaho, they do a selection system, so they only cut out a few of medium and large trees and keep the rest different ages, different species. And so this is a more sustainable forestry practice than clear cutting for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Why don't we always do this? Because it's more expensive and it's actually less safe for loggers. On page 320, now we're talking about fires. So fires are actually important to many, many ecosystems because they clear out debris, they thin the forest, they germinate the seeds of some plants like sequoias and ponderosa pines only germinate after a fire. We've had years of fire suppression that have led to mega fires, so we have way more understudy and shrubs in our forest than we need to, and little trees that are all crowded. And that's because for a long time we thought fire was bad. And down here, the question, aren't all forest fires bad? No, fire is extremely important to maintain the health of forests. When we have low intensity, so up here it says low intensity frequent fires, so little fires throughout the year, it protects the ecosystem overall. But the problem is for about the last 70 or 80 years is we have put out all fires, including ones from lightning strikes, because we're like, fire's bad, fire's bad, fire's bad, and then we've created this huge problem that has led to mega fires. So what we're trying to do now to resolve this, so we made this big problem, how do we fix it? Well, we do in some places prescribed burns. If you've ever been to Sequoia National Park, usually during the summer they have some prescribed burns. And they'll set the fire and make sure it stays low, so not on a windy day, and they have parameters that help keep the ecosystem healthy. We also can do something called salvage logging, where we can go in and remove trees and branches and things that a fire would normally burn. We can remove those things. Okay, we have this picture here of the pine mountain beetle, which is a very famous pest that is destroying forests. So the figure in caption is actually right here for pine mountain beetle. And then in general, how do we protect forests from pathogens and bad insects? So it could be a virus or bacteria, or most likely an insect. We can do integrated pest management like we did for agriculture. So in the last chapter you learned about IPM for agriculture. We can do some of these things with forests too. We can also remove infected trees, so we can go through and remove them. But again, that's if you look at a giant forest, it's really hard to do and it costs a lot of money. And we'll continue on with the next video.